Welcome to the deep dive. If you're listening to this right now, it means you probably have a certain appetite for the profound.
Right. And the unsettling. Definitely the
Yeah,
unsettling.
exactly. The profound, the unsettling, and honestly, the brilliant. Because today, we've curated a custom-tailored journey just for you. We are delving into the incredibly rich, slightly terrifying, and entirely fascinating opening chapters of C.S. Lewis's That Hideous Strength.
Which is such a wild ride.
It really is. And look, I know what might immediately pop into your head. C.S. Lewis, the Narnia guy.
Right. The wardrobe, the talking lion.
The endless winter, all of that. I need you to take all of that, just fold it up and set it completely aside.
Yeah, this is not Narnia.
Not even close. What we're looking at today is a vastly different beast. We are going to unpack how a legendary author takes the most mundane, boring, everyday thing you can possibly imagine.
Academic bureaucracy.
Yes. Committee meetings, office politics, and he seamlessly blends it with chilling dystopian science fiction and ancient, earth-shaking Arthurian magic.
It sounds crazy when you say it out loud,
Mm-hmm.
but it works so well.
It really does. So, okay, let's really unpack this because we have a mountain of source material to get through. And the sheer scope of what Lewis is doing here is just mind-boggling.
It is.
Our mission today is to decode these opening chapters, to figure out how the deepest evils can masquerade as boring administrative agenda items, and how the oldest magic might just be buried right under our feet.
It truly is a remarkable piece of literature. And to really understand what we're diving into and why it matters to you, we have to look at how Lewis himself framed it in his preface.
Right, the preface is key.
Yeah, he calls this a tall story about devilry. But he's very quick to point out that it has a deeply serious point behind it. He actually links it directly to his philosophical work, The Abolition of Man.
Which is a heavy text on its own.
Oh, absolutely. And for those who might not be intimately familiar with that text, the core argument is essentially this. If society abandons objective values,
Like if we decide that right and wrong are just subjective feelings?
exactly. If we do that, then humanity just becomes raw material to be manipulated by whoever happens to be in power.
The conditioners, as he calls them.
Right, the conditioners.
Mm.
And the absolute genius of the setting here in That Hideous Strength is precisely its mundanity. Lewis writes that the outer rim of this profound devilry had to be shown touching the life of some perfectly ordinary, respectable profession.
And he chose his own right.
Yeah, he chose academia. Not because he thought university fellows were more corrupt than anyone else, but simply because it was the world he knew best.
Right, he grounds the cosmic in the completely ordinary, so he creates this fictional, very small university town called Edgestowe, and specifically focuses on a tiny, ancient institution called Bracton College.
Which feels so incredibly real.
It does, and placing apocalyptic stakes inside a wood-paneled room with men drinking sherry and arguing over budgets is such a profound statement about how evil actually operates in the real world.
Oh, totally.
Because it rarely arrives with thunder and lightning right. It usually arrives with a memo, a budget proposal, and a quiet conversation over a drink.
Exactly. And to guide the reader through this collision of the mundane and the cosmic, Lewis gives us a dual narrative.
The Studdocks.
Yeah, we follow a married couple, Mark and Jane Studdock, and right from the very start of the text, it's painfully obvious that they are deeply disconnected from each other.
It's actually hard to read sometimes how disconnected they are.
It is. They're basically living in entirely different psychological universes, even though they share this small, tidy flat. We're going to follow Mark as he gets slowly, almost pathetically seduced by institutional power.
And on the flip side, we have his wife, Jane.
Right, a scholar who is trying to write a thesis on the poet John Donne.
But she finds her reality completely shattered by violent supernatural visions that she just cannot explain.
Yeah, so we have these two distinct paths laid out before us. Mark's descent into a sterile, man-made dystopia, and Jane's terrifying awakening to a raw, ancient, magical reality.
I want to start by looking at Mark because honestly, his journey is just uncomfortably relatable.
Oh, it's painfully relatable.
Think about your own workplace or social circles for a second as you're listening to this. Mark is a sociologist at Bracton College, and when we first meet him, he is experiencing this intense, almost embarrassing surge of joy.
All because he's been accepted into a group.
Right, because he has finally been accepted into what is known as the progressive element at the college. But wait, Mark is a smart guy. He's an academic. Why is he so utterly obsessed with this completely unofficial group of middle management academics?
Because Lewis understands something deeply, terrifyingly true about human vanity.
Yeah.
Mark's entire motivation, at least initially, isn't some grand villainous scheme. It is the simple, universal human desire to belong.
He just wants to be in.
He wants to be in the inner ring. The source text describes a moment where Mark meets Curry. Curry is the subwarden of Bracton.
Which essentially means he's second in command of the college's administrative body.
Right. So Mark meets Curry outside the post office. And Curry casually falls into step with Mark to discuss the agenda for an upcoming college meeting.
And Curry uses a very specific word.
Yes, he uses the pronoun we to describe their faction. Lewis writes something like, "You would never have guessed from the tone of Studdock's reply what intense pleasure he derived from Curry's use of the pronoun we."
That is such a sharp observation. Just the word we is like a drug to him.
It's entirely intoxicating because until very recently, Mark was an outsider. He used to look at Curry and his allies and call them Curry and his gang.
With a mix of awe and resentment.
Exactly. But now that he's inside, the gang has magically become we, or the progressive element in college.
Wow.
Lewis is showing us the very first stepping stone to corruption. It's not a pact with the devil signed in blood at midnight. It's the profound relief of no longer being on the outside looking in.
It's the flattery of being consulted by the important people.
Yeah. Mark is so desperate to maintain this new status that he constantly monitors his own behavior. He's terrified of doing anything that might get him kicked out of the circle again.
You can just feel his insecurity radiating off the page.
Oh, for sure.
There's this incredibly telling moment where Curry casually mentions that Dick is going to be at the meeting, and Mark's mind immediately starts darting around frantically.
Because he has no idea who Dick is.
None. He doesn't know who Dick is, but he is terrified of admitting that to Curry because a true insider should know who Dick is.
Naturally.
So he actually guesses a completely obscure colleague named Richard Telford just to cover his tracks.
Which is such a desperate move.
It really is. And Curry laughs and says, "Good Lord."
If-
Telford. No, I mean Lord Feverstone, Dick Devine as he used to be.
And Mark just smoothly pivots.
He does. He joins in the laugh, pretending he was just making a little joke.
It is pathetic, but it's also a brilliant psychological portrait. I mean, if you put yourself in his shoes, if you've ever been the new person at a company or in a social group trying to keep up with the veterans, you know exactly the panic Mark is feeling.
You don't want to look stupid.
Exactly. He is willing to suppress his own ignorance and pretend to be something he's not, just to keep a seat at the table.
And it's this exact vulnerability that makes him the perfect target for what the progressive element is about to pull off at the Bracton College meeting.
They need a useful idiot.
Yep. And Mark's desperation to belong makes him the perfect candidate. Which brings us to the college meeting itself.
Oh, this meeting is a masterclass.
Reading through this section of the text, it is an absolute masterclass in manipulative bureaucracy.
So what's the actual goal here?
The true goal of the progressive element, so that's Curry, the bursar James Busby, and now this Lord Feverstone character, their goal is to sell a piece of college property called Bragton Wood.
And they're selling it to the N.I.C.E.
Right, the National Institute of Coordinated Experiments. We're going to get into who they actually are shortly, but for now the objective is simply to get the college fellows, the voting members of the academic staff, to vote yes on the sale.
But there's a problem.
There's a big problem. Bragton Wood is historically significant and beloved by the older, more traditional fellows, the ones the progressives call the diehards.
So how do they get the sale approved without a massive fight?
They use parliamentary procedure as a weapon.
This is where Lewis shows his deep familiarity with institutional politics.
Yes. They bury the actual sale of the wood deep in the agenda. Item 15 is listed vaguely as sale of college land.
But item 1 on the agenda is questions about Bragton Wood.
Exactly. By separating the questions from the sale, they manage to control the narrative entirely from the moment the meeting starts.
It's so sneaky.
It is. Under item 1, Curry reads letters from a preservation society complaining about the wall around the wood, and a letter from some spiritualists wanting to investigate supernatural phenomena there.
Which is brilliant because it immediately makes all the college fellas defensive.
Right. They want the outside world to know that Bragton Wood is private property and it's none of their business.
And then Lord Feverstone stands up.
He agrees they shouldn't listen to outside busybodies, but he casually asks the bursar, James Busby, who is essentially the chief financial officer of the college, if it isn't true that the wall of the wood is actually in terrible condition.
This is a completely orchestrated performance, right?
Absolutely. It is pure theater. Busby, who is described as a large ex-clergyman with a bushy black beard, stands up and says, actually, the wall is beyond repair. Only a complete brand new wall will do.
And then he drops the hammer?
He drops a massive, terrifying estimated cost for this new wall on the room. The college gasps. Feverstone acts shocked and asks if Busby is seriously suggesting the college take on that enormous expense.
And Busby says very ominously that this question cannot be treated in isolation from some important financial considerations he has to share later in the meeting.
And what Lewis is illustrating here is the brilliant, deeply cynical use of manufactured financial panic.
Yeah.
Busby is deliberately creating a crisis out of thin air to force a specific outcome. Because later in the agenda, there is a discussion about raising the stipends of the junior fellows.
So who are young academics barely making enough money to live on.
Right. So Busby tells the room that this much-needed raise is the second proposal involving heavy expenditure they've heard that morning.
He expertly pits the cost of the hypothetical new wall against the desperately needed raise for the junior staff.
Exactly. By the time they break for lunch, every junior fellow has it fixed in their mind that a new wall for the wood and a rise in their own salary are strictly exclusive alternatives.
They can't have both.
They can have both. So when they finally get to item 15 late in the afternoon when everyone is tired, cranky, and hungry, it's no longer called the controversial sale of Bragdon Wood.
It's just the mundane sale of the area colored pink on the plan.
And magically, the sale solves everything. It solves the problem of the crumbling wall. It solves the college's financial problem. It provides the money for the junior stipends.
The sale becomes the magical cure-all.
And the opposition is completely, utterly outmaneuvered.
And the most chilling moment of that entire meeting is how they treat the opposition when they do try to speak up.
Oh, it's heartbreaking.
There's an elderly blind fellow named Canon Jewell. He represents the old world, the traditions of the college. He tries to stand up and speak against the sale.
And his voice is barely audible, shaking with age and emotion.
Yeah, and Lord Feverstone just folds his arms, looks straight at this shaky old man, and says in a loud, clear voice, "If Canon Jewell wishes us not to hear his views, I suggest that his end could be better attained by silence."
It's so incredibly cruel.
It is. The old man is just stunned into silence and the motion passes.
And we really need to pause on how Feverstone justifies that cruelty.
We do.
Yeah.
Because when Mark asks Feverstone about it later over drinks, Feverstone doesn't flinch. He just says, "I take the Clausewitz view. Total war is the most humane in the long run." I shut him up instantaneously.
Now, for context for you listening, Karl von Clausewitz was a 19th century Prussian military theorist.
Right. And total war essentially means a war with no rules, no restrictions.
Where every resource is mobilized and non-combatants are considered legitimate targets to force a quick surrender.
Exactly. Feverstone is taking a military philosophy of mass destruction and applying it to an elderly, blind academic in a committee meeting.
He justifies his cruelty by claiming he saved the old man from working himself into a heart attack.
It's a perfect encapsulation of how this new, efficient, progressive mindset operates. Empathy, tradition, and basic human decency are just obstacles to be steamrolled over in the name of progress.
But wait, I have to ask. Mark is watching all of this happen. He sees an old, blind colleague get verbally brutalized. Why doesn't he object?
Yeah, why doesn't that break the spell?
Why doesn't that break the spell of the inner ring for him?
Because Mark is completely anesthetized by his own inclusion in the group that is doing the bullying.
Wow.
When you are desperately trying to prove you belong with the cool kids, you don't defend the kid they're picking on. You join in the laughter so they know you're on their side.
Mark suppresses his conscience because his desire for status is far stronger than his moral compass.
Which is deeply unsettling, especially when you think about how easily that translates to modern corporate environments.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Which brings us perfectly to the post-meeting drinks in Curry's rooms, where the facade of what this progress actually means starts to crack.
Curry, Busby, Feverstone, and Mark are celebrating their victory.
Curry and Busby are absolutely euphoric about the N.I.C.E. buying the land. They view it as the ultimate triumph of practical idealism.
They're imagining this massive fusion of state power and scientific laboratory, finally freed from what they call the red tape of economic and ethical restraints.
But if you listen to the way they describe it, it's absurd bureaucratic utopianism.
Busby is raving about mobilizing all the talent of the country. He's boasting about 15 departmental directors making £15,000 a year each.
With their own massive legal staff and their own independent police force.
Think about that for a second. Why does a scientific research institute need its own independent armed police force?
It makes no sense.
But Curry and Busby are too dazzled by the sheer scale and the massive salaries to ask those basic, terrifying questions.
My favorite part of their delusion, and honestly the part that made me laugh out loud reading the text, is Curry talking about the pragmatometer.
Oh, the pragmatometer.
He seriously says there are to be 40 interlocking committees sitting every day, and they've got a wonderful gadget by which the findings of each committee print themselves off in their own little compartment on the analytical notice board every half hour.
It's so specific.
Then that report slides itself into the right position where it's connected up by little arrows with all the relevant parts of the other reports. The different kinds of business come out in different colored lights. They call it a pragmatometer.
It's hilarious. It's the ultimate satire of middle management obsession with process over product.
Exactly. Lewis is illustrating a profound principle here. Bureaucracies often use an obsession with process to mask a complete lack of moral purpose.
Busby even chimes in saying, pragmatometry is going to be a big thing. Hundreds of people are going in for it.
They don't actually know what the N.I.C.E. is going to do. They're just obsessed with the aesthetics of its organization.
The interlocking committees, the gadgets, the flow charts, they are the useful idiots of this operation.
They think they are the vanguard of a new age, but they're just the guys opening the door for the real monsters.
And Lord Feverstone knows it.
Oh, he absolutely knows it. Because the moment Curry and Busby leave the room to go to bed, Feverstone looks at Mark, chuckles, and then throws his head back and roars with infectious laughter.
He says, it really is rather devastating that the people one has to use for getting things done should talk such drivel about the things themselves.
Feverstone completely dismisses Curry and Busby as fools. He tells Mark that they don't have a ghost of a notion where they are going.
They will sweat blood to bring the N.I.C.E. to Edgestowe, and that makes them indispensable tools, but they have no idea what the actual point of the Institute is.
And this is the critical moment where Feverstone decides to pull Mark up to the next level of secrecy.
He realizes Mark isn't quite as naive as Curry and Busby. Mark had casually observed earlier that the most important thing about the N.I.C.E. was its own police force and its backing by the state.
That cynical observation proved to Feverstone that Mark was ready for the real pitch.
And the real pitch is terrifying.
It is. Feverstone drops the bureaucratic mask entirely and tells Mark what the N.I.C.E. is actually trying to achieve.
He says, if science is really given a free hand, it can now take over the human race and recondition it. Make man a really efficient animal.
He lays out three main problems the Institute is tackling. First, the interplanetary problem.
He mentions a man named Weston who could have helped, but says Weston was murdered by a Cambridge Dawn with a game leg.
Now, for you listeners familiar with Lewis's wider space trilogy, you'll recognize Weston as the villain from the previous books and the Cambridge Dawn as Elwyn Ransom, the hero.
But Feverstone skips past that to the second problem, rivals on Earth.
He says there is far too much life of every kind about, animal and vegetable, and they need to clear the place.
But it's the third problem that is the real core of their agenda.
Yes. The third problem is man himself. Now, before we detail this, we must explicitly state a critical boundary for our discussion.
Yes, please.
We are about to delve into some deeply disturbing, politically charged, dystopian concepts presented in the text. Just to be clear, for you listening, we are impartially reporting the chilling ideology of the antagonists in this story. We are absolutely not endorsing these views. Our goal is simply to analyze the dystopian nightmare Lewis is constructing to warn his readers.
Thank you for setting that context, because Feverstone's words are brutal. He tells Mark, man has got to take charge of man. That means, remember, that some men have got to take charge of the rest.
He outlines a horrific progression, starting with sterilization of the unfit, liquidation of backward races, and selective breeding.
Then moving on to real education, which he defines as making the patient exactly what the Institute wants, regardless of what the patient or their parents want.
He says it will be mainly psychological at first, but eventually they will move on to biochemical conditioning and direct manipulation of the brain.
The ultimate goal is to create a new type of man, manufactured and controlled completely by the N.I.C.E.
It is pure, unadulterated totalitarianism wrapped up in the sterile language of scientific efficiency, and we have to look at Mark's reaction here.
Mark is sitting there, hearing this monstrous plan to liquidate races and manipulate brains. Does he run screaming from the room? Does he call the authorities?
No, his only concern, his only trouble is that he doesn't see how he can contribute.
He actually says, don't think it's false modesty, but I haven't yet seen how I can contribute.
He is so desperate to be part of the ultimate inner ring that he is willing to completely overlook the utter atrocity of what they're planning, just as long as they have a use for him.
It's astounding. He's literally being pitched genocide and mind control. And his response is basically, but what's my job title?
And Feverstone tells him exactly what his role will be. He says they need a trained sociologist who can write.
Not to write up the truth, but to camouflage it.
This is where Lewis is exposing the terrifying weaponization of language. Feverstone explains the mechanics of propaganda.
He tells Mark that you can't just tell the British public that the N.I.C.E. wants vast state powers to experiment on criminals.
If you say experiment, the public will be up in arms.
But if you call it the re-education of the maladjusted, the public, in Feverstone's incredibly crude words, slobbers with delight.
He notes this bizarre psychological quirk of the modern public. The word experiment is deeply unpopular, but not the word experimental.
You can't tell people you want to experiment on their children, but if you offer them free education in an experimental school attached to the institute, everyone thinks it's a wonderful progressive opportunity.
So they need Mark to be their spin doctor. They don't need his scientific expertise at all. They need his ability to craft palatable lies that will convince the House of Commons and the public to hand over ultimate power.
They need him to write the press releases for the apocalypse.
And Mark, flushed with pure excitement at being valued and brought into the inner circle, eagerly agrees to go with Feverstone the next day to Belbury to meet John Wither, the deputy director, and secure his job.
Which takes us to Belbury itself. And let me tell you, if you thought the Bracton College meeting was frustrating to read about, Belbury is an entirely different level of psychological warfare.
The journey there sets the tone perfectly. Mark gets into Feverstone's massive, powerful car, and they speed out of Edgestowe.
Mark is both fascinated and repelled by Feverstone's aggressive, insolent driving. It all speaks to this masculine energy, this idea of big, important men doing big, important things.
But when they arrive at Belbury, the headquarters of the N.I.C.E., which is ironically and terrifyingly housed temporarily in a blood transfusion office, Mark is immediately thrown completely off balance.
Right. He's expecting to walk into a crisp, efficient corporate environment, and instead he gets introduced to John Wither, the deputy director.
And Wither is, well, he is an absolute nightmare of a boss, but not in the way you'd expect. He doesn't yell. He doesn't threaten.
The text describes him as a white-haired old man with a large, clean-shaven face and watery blue eyes that never seem to focus on anything.
His entire demeanor is vague, chaotic, and aggressively polite.
Wither is a masterpiece of characterization. I want to look at some of his actual dialogue because it is brilliantly infuriating.
When Mark tries to nail down the specifics of his job, simple things like what he'll be doing, what his salary will be, where he should live, Wither drowns him in a sea of corporate buzzwords and non-committal fluff.
The text says Wither's conversation had the exact opposite effect of putting Mark at ease. Wither says things like, "There was never any idea of circumscribing your activities and your general influence on policy without the fullest possible consideration of your own views."
It sounds like it means something, but it means absolutely nothing.
I have to read the quote that completely broke my brain.
Go for it.
When Mark pushes again about the scope of the appointment, Wither replies, "Obviously, neither you nor I would wish to commit ourselves in this room in any sense which was at all injurious to the powers of the committee. We do not really think among ourselves in terms of strictly demarcated functions, of course.
It gets worse.
Everyone in the Institute feels that his own work is not so much a departmental contribution as a moment or grade in the progressive self-definition of an organic whole."
A moment or grade in the progressive self-definition of an organic whole.
You could write a whole thesis on just how brilliantly awful that sentence is.
Think about your own workplace for a second. Have you ever sat in a meeting where a manager used terms like elasticity or synergy or agile paradigms to avoid answering a direct question?
That's exactly the trap Wither is setting for Mark here. It's designed to make you feel stupid for even asking for clarity.
And Mark, who is fundamentally young, shy, vain, and timid, falls right into the trap.
Instead of pushing back and demanding a straight answer, he tries to play along. He says, "I do think that is so important. The elasticity of your organization is one of the things that attracts me."
He uses the word elasticity to try and sound like he understands the jargon, like he's fluent in their language.
But inside, he's tortured by the question, what are we both talking about? He is completely lost.
And the cherry on top of this infuriating interaction is that Wither never actually tells him his salary, never officially gives him a job, but miraculously at the end of the interview, he seamlessly extracts 200 pounds from Mark for a life membership to the N.I.C.E. club.
Mark is so flustered and so eager not to seem uncooperative that he just agrees, blushing because he doesn't have his checkbook on him.
It's a masterful shakedown, disguised as a polite onboarding.
This raises an important question about the architecture of confusion that defines Bilberry. Why is the deputy director acting this way?
It's not incompetence.
No, it is a highly refined control tactic. Bilberry functions by maintaining an environment of overlapping jurisdictions and manufactured insecurity.
By never defining Mark's role, Wither ensures that Mark can never succeed, but also can never definitively fail.
He is kept in a state of constant anxiety, desperate for approval from the top because there is no objective standard of performance to rely on.
It is institutional gaslighting.
And this hostility extends far beyond Wither's office.
When Mark leaves the office, Feverstone, the man who brought him there, his supposed sponsor, the guy who pitched him a whole dystopian vision, just spots someone he knows, yells, "Hello, guy," shakes Mark's hand, and completely abandons him.
Mark is left to wander into the massive dining hall entirely alone, looking like a fool.
It's the classic high school cafeteria nightmare, but weaponized for adults. He sits down next to strangers who are talking rapidly in acronyms IJP, DD, HD, completely ignoring him.
Later in the coffee room, he runs into Bill the Blizzard, or Hengist, the eminent Bracton scientist.
Hengist is a fascinating contrast.
He is the one guy at N.I.C.E. who actually does real, hard science, and he is thoroughly disgusted by the whole operation.
He tells Mark that the college meeting was all nonsense, that N.I.C.E. had the government power to compel the sale of Bragdon Wood anyway, and they just made the college go through the motions for their own amusement.
That must have been a gut punch for Mark, realizing his great victory at the meeting was completely meaningless.
That should have been a wake-up call.
Hengist says he's leaving the Institute that very night, and he gives Mark a very clear warning. He says, "I don't know what you were doing at Bracton, but if it is any good, I'd advise you to go back and stick to it."
He warns Mark that they could play the devil with a young fellow like him.
But Mark, stubborn in his desire to be important, ignores the warning. Hengist introduces him to a man named Steele, who is supposedly the head director of sociology, which would conceptually make him Mark's boss.
And Steele is actively, aggressively hostile. He loudly complains to a colleague right in front of Mark that Feverstone has just unloaded this chap on our department without a word to me about it.
He tells Mark there is no room for a man in their show who doesn't know the work. Mark is humiliated, feeling completely put in a false position.
But then Professor Philostrato, a massive, dark-haired physiologist with a treble voice, sweeps in and pulls Mark away.
Philostrato tells Mark to completely ignore Steele. He says Steele and Feverstone are rabble of no consequence.
Philostrato tells him, as long as you have the goodwill of the deputy director, you snap your fingers at them. You need to listen to no one but him.
Do you see the pattern Lewis is weaving here? Feverstone says ignore Jules, the figurehead of the N.I.C.E. Wither ignores all definitions and boundaries. Steele ignores Feverstone's authority to hire Mark. Philostrato says ignore Steele's authority over his own department.
The entire organization is fundamentally designed to break down a person's boundaries by making every relationship conditional, every chain of command fluid, and every alliance temporary.
The only way to survive in an environment like that is to abandon all your own principles and become entirely dependent on the chaotic center of power.
And as if that wasn't terrifying enough, Philostrato gives Mark one final piece of advice before leaving him. He says, "Do not have the fairy for your enemy."
He introduces Mark to Miss Hardcastle, the head of the institutional police.
And what a visual Lewis gives us here.
She is a thickly built woman in a black, short-skirted uniform. She has iron gray cropped hair, a square, stern face, and a smudge of lipstick laid on with violent inattention.
She chews on an unlit, long black cheroot, constantly removing it to stare at the saliva on the end before shoving it back in her mouth.
She immediately sits down, flings her leg over the arm of a chair, and fixes Mark with a gaze of cold intimacy.
Her hand grip feels like a Stoker's or a Carter's. She exudes this rank, insolent sexuality combined with sheer brute force.
Miss Hardcastle the Fairy is the brutal enforcer of the N.I.C.E.'s ideology. While the others mask their intentions in bureaucratic jargon like Wither or scientific utopianism like Philostrato, the Fairy is monstrously realistic.
Over a whiskey and soda with Mark, she drifts into police reminiscences. And this is where we get one of the most chilling lines in the entire text.
She casually assumes, as a matter of plain statistical fact, that about 30% of all murder trials end in the hanging of an innocent man.
30%. And she doesn't say this with regret, right?
Not at all. She says it as a point of professional pride, an inside joke among those who truly understand how power works.
For her, the justice system isn't about truth. It's about processing bodies, maintaining terror, and enforcing order.
The innocence or guilt of the individual is statistically irrelevant to the machinery of the state.
And Mark, desperate to be seen as worldly, tough, and part of the in-crowd, sits there and listens to her detail the mechanics of the execution shed, gradually horrified but too fundamentally weak to object.
This is the world Mark is choosing, a world of sterile control, manufactured confusion, and brute systemic violence.
Okay, while Mark is eagerly surrendering his autonomy to this sterile, man-made bureaucracy, something entirely different and far more visceral is happening back at his flat.
We need to transition from the neon-lit corridors of the N.I.C.E. to the quiet, oppressive solitude of Jane Studdock's life in Edgestowe.
The thematic contrast Lewis builds here is incredible. Mark is surrounded by people, plotting, maneuvering, caught up in the frantic energy of ambition. Jane is utterly, profoundly alone.
The source text gives us a glimpse into her mind on the morning of the college meeting. She's looking at her tidy little kitchen, the bed's made, the room's done. She realizes there's nothing that has to be done until 6 o'clock.
She quotes from the wedding service. Matrimony was ordained, thirdly, for the mutual society, help, and comfort that the one ought to have of the other. And she says it bitterly.
It's a tragic realization, and Lewis uses it to paint a vivid picture of the gender dynamics and the intellectual starvation she is experiencing in this 1940s academic setting.
For Jane, marriage hasn't been a partnership. It has been the door out of a vibrant world of academic work, comradeship, and laughter into something she explicitly describes as solitary confinement.
She is trying to work on her doctorate thesis on the poetry of John Donne. She wants to force herself back into her lost enthusiasm for the subject.
But the isolation is suffocating her. However, her mundane depression is suddenly violently interrupted.
She glances at a newspaper on the table, sees a picture on the back page, and is immediately plunged back into the memory of a terrifying nightmare she had the night before.
I was reading the notes on Jane's storyline, and her nightmare genuinely gave me chills. It's so specific, almost cinematic. What exactly is Lewis doing with this imagery?
The dream starts with a face. A foreign-looking face, bearded, yellowish, with a hooked nose. But it's the expression that's horrifying.
The mouth is sagging open, the eyes staring in the way a man's eyes stare for a second or two after a sudden shock.
But in the dream, this face seems to be meeting a shock that lasts for hours.
And then the dream expands to reveal the context of that face. The face belongs to a man hunched in the corner of a small, whitewashed cell. A door opens, and a good-looking man with a pointed gray beard comes in.
The detail that makes this dream so extraordinarily realistic and so terrifying for Jane is the dialogue.
In all her previous dreams, she either understood the dream people magically or didn't hear them at all.
But here the conversation is in French. Jane understands bits of it, just as she would in real life with her level of education.
Right. The visitor tells the prisoner something he intends as good news. The prisoner says, "Tiens, ça marche," but then wavers.
The visitor presses his point in a low, fluent voice. He wears pince-nez glasses that catch the light, making his eyes invisible, and he has an almost unnatural perfection to his teeth.
Jane feels a deep, disagreeable impression. She can't make out what the visitor is proposing, but suddenly the dream turns into pure nightmare.
The visitor smiles a cold smile, seizes the prisoner's head between his hands, gives it a sharp turn like taking a helmet off a diver, and literally unscrews the prisoner's head and takes it away.
It is grotesque.
But it serves a vital thematic purpose. It represents the ultimate separation of the intellect from the body, which is exactly what the N.I.C.E. wants to achieve scientifically.
But the dream doesn't stop there. It gets even stranger. All becomes confused, but the center of the dream is still a head. Only now it's a different head.
It's a head with a reddish-white beard, covered in earth. It belongs to an old man being dug up in a churchyard. He's described as a sort of ancient British, druidical kind of man in a long mantle.
And this ancient buried thing is coming to life. In her dream, Jane is screaming, "Look out, he's alive! Stop! Stop! You're waking him!"
But they don't stop. The old man sits up and starts talking in something that sounds vaguely like Spanish, and that terrifies Jane so badly she wakes up.
Now, you or I might write that off as just a terrible, stress-induced nightmare, maybe too much cheese before bed.
Sure.
But here is the terrifying pivot that completely shatters Jane's reality. As she looks at that newspaper on her table the next morning, she sees the exact face from her dream.
The face of the prisoner in the cell.
The headline reads, "Execution of Alcazan," and beneath it, "Scientist Bluebeard goes to guillotine." The paper explains that Alcazan was a distinguished radiologist, an Arab by descent, who cut short his career by poisoning his wife.
Jane tries to rationalize it, of course. She thinks, I must have seen an earlier picture of him weeks ago when the trial began, and my subconscious just brought it up.
She desperately tries to cling to her rational, modern academic worldview.
She sweeps her books away, puts on her hat, and basically flees the flat. She needs to get out.
It is a phenomenal contrast. Mark is actively running towards this sterile, futuristic, bureaucratic dystopia. Meanwhile, Jane, sitting alone in her kitchen, is being violently assaulted by raw, ancient, organic terrors.
Severed heads, executed scientists, and ancient druids bursting out of the earth.
She is being drafted into a cosmic war without her consent, and this leads her directly to the home of her former tutor, Dr. Cecil Dimble, and his wife, Mother Dimble.
Jane goes there for comfort, for a sense of normalcy. She wants to be around the Dimbles because they represent the warmth, tradition, and intellectual honesty that Bracton College is actively trying to destroy.
Yes, and the Dimbles are facing their own crisis, which perfectly links the two narratives.
When Jane arrives at their beautiful house by the river Wind, Dr. Dimble tells her she'd better take a good look at the garden because they are being kicked out.
Bracton College is refusing to renew their lease because they're selling the land to the N.I.C.E. So the very mundane administrative maneuvering Mark was participating in over at the college is having an immediate, devastating impact on Jane's only safe haven.
But Dr. Dimble, being a true scholar, doesn't spend lunch complaining about the college administration. Instead, he takes Jane on a deep dive into the Arthurian legend.
And this conversation is not just academic filler, it is the absolute key to understanding the mythology of the entire book.
Let's really dig into what Dimble says here because it's fascinating. He talks about how the Arthurian legend has two distinct sets of characters.
On one side, you have Guinevere, Lancelot, and the courtly figures. They are very Romanized, very Christian, representing a sort of civilized order.
But in the background, there is an undertow of dark, native British figures like Morgan and Morgoth. They are mixed up with ancient magic, with druidism.
Dimble paints a picture of 5th century Britain on the eve of the Anglo-Saxon invasion. You have a society trying to hold on to Roman Christian civilization, speaking a Celticized Latin, which Dimble specifically notes would sound to us rather like Spanish.
But out in the country, you have old British underkings speaking something like Welsh and practicing ancient druidism. Arthur is trying to pull this fractured society together.
And then Dimble brings up the anomaly, the piece of the puzzle that doesn't quite fit the binary of good Christian versus evil pagan, Merlin.
Dimble says Merlin is the really interesting figure. Why? Because he is obviously a druid. He's a magician. But he is not evil.
He actually knows all about the Holy Grail.
He stands at the crossroads of these two worlds. Dimble wonders if Merlin represents the last trace of something that became impossible later on, a time when the people in touch with the natural, supernatural forces of the earth didn't have to be strictly categorized as either white or black, either priests or sorcerers.
Mrs. Dimble, who is practical and a bit unnerved by this talk, says it's a horrid idea, but at least Merlin is safely dead and buried under Bragton Wood.
And that is the moment the bomb drops. Dimble corrects her. He says, according to the ancient story, Merlin is buried, but not dead.
Buried but not dead. The legend says Merlin is buried in Bragton Wood, right under the ancient well that the Bracton archaeologists agree is late British Roman work.
Now think about what we learned at the Bracton College meeting. The N.I.C.E. is spending an astronomical amount of money to buy Bragton Wood.
They specifically want the area colored pink on the map, which includes the well. Dimble connects the dots. He says, I wonder what they will find if they start digging up that place for the foundations of their N.I.C.E.
Mrs. Dimble argues it's just mud and water, making it a terrible place to build a modern institute.
Dimble replies, and if so, why should they want to come here at all? They're not likely to be influenced by any poetic fancy about Merlin's mantle having fallen on them.
He concludes that some of the inner circle of the N.I.C.E. would very much like to recover that mantle of power, but he doubts they'd like it if the old man himself came back to life along with it.
So if we pull all these threads together, the implication is staggering.
It means the N.I.C.E., this ultra-modern, hyper-scientific, bureaucratic machine that wants to sterilize the unfit and manipulate the human brain, isn't just looking for a building site.
They are looking for ancient magic. They are actively seeking to unearth a 5th century druid wizard to harness his raw power for their dystopian ends.
The collision of the most sterile, futuristic science and the rawest, most ancient magic is their actual goal.
And for Jane, this revelation is simply too much. Hearing about a man buried but not dead, and a language that sounds like Spanish, perfectly aligns with the horrifying second half of her nightmare.
She nearly faints at the table. She is forced to tell the Dimbles her dream. Dr. Dimble is visibly shocked.
He mutters, "Extraordinary thing. 2 heads. And one of them Alcazan's." He realizes immediately that Jane hasn't just had a bad dream, she has seen something of massive strategic importance.
He advises her that if she wants to get analyzed, she shouldn't go to a normal psychotherapist. He points her toward a specific person, someone his wife has the address for.
And Jane's subsequent journey to find this person is so incredibly atmospheric. She takes a train out of Edgestowe to a place called St. Anne's on the hill.
It's the terminus of the branch line, the literal end of the line. The train jerks and rattles along, passing right over Bragdon Wood itself.
She gets off at St. Anne's, and the air is cold and tonic. She has to climb a steep hill to get to the village, past a church, past an old Saxon cross.
She finds a high wall that seems to run on forever with an old iron bell pull. She rings it, and there's this long, chilly silence.
Finally, she hears feet approaching. A tall, striking woman named Camilla Denniston opens the door. She leads Jane through a garden, past a water butt, into a large, sparely furnished room.
The whole place feels austere, almost monastic. It's the complete exact opposite of the buzzing, chaotic, over-furnished halls of Belbury, where her husband is currently selling his soul.
This brings us to the pivotal encounter with Miss Ironwood. Jane goes in expecting modern medical comfort.
She expects a doctor who will tell her she's just stressed, maybe prescribe some rest, and validate her rational worldview.
But Miss Ironwood, dressed all in black with large, strong hands, offers zero psychological comfort. She is intensely serious.
When Jane tells her about the dream of the severed head and the druid, Miss Ironwood is so affected that her immensely strong fingers actually snap her wooden pencil in half.
But her diagnosis is not medical, it is ontological. And by ontological, we mean it has to do with the very nature of being and reality itself, not just a psychological quirk of the brain.
She tells Jane, "The reason you cannot be cured is that you are not ill."
I love that line. The reason you cannot be cured is that you are not ill.
Jane is confused, obviously, insisting there must be something wrong with her mind, that it isn't natural to have dreams like that.
And Miss Ironwood drops the absolute truth on her. You are a more important person than you imagine.
Miss Ironwood explains that Jane has something called vision. It's the hereditary power of dreaming realities.
She traces it back to Jane's maiden name, Tudor, and an ancestor who wrote a perfectly accurate account of the Battle of Worcester on the very day it was fought, despite being miles away and not participating. He dreamed it right.
Miss Ironwood tells Jane that she has seen real things in her dreams. She saw Alcazan exactly as he really sat in the condemned cell. She saw the visitor he really had.
Jane tries to fight this diagnosis with everything she has. She says she doesn't believe in that sort of thing, that her academic upbringing makes it natural she wouldn't.
She just wants an ordinary life. She wants to be left alone to do her own work on John Donne. She begs to be cured.
But Miss Ironwood is relentless. She says, if you go to a psychotherapist, he will proceed on the assumption that the dreams reflect your own subconscious. He would try to treat you. It would certainly not remove the dreams.
Miss Ironwood is basically telling Jane that the universe is larger, stranger, and far more dangerous than her comfortable academic upbringing allows her to believe.
And then comes the ultimatum. Miss Ironwood reveals that Dr. Dimble didn't send Jane there to be cured. He sent her to give information.
Jane is deeply offended by this, feeling she's being used by everyone around her.
But Miss Ironwood lays out the cosmic stakes. She says, the things you have seen concern something compared with which the happiness or even the life of you and me is of no importance. You cannot get rid of your gift. You can try to suppress it, but you will fail and you will be badly frightened. On the other hand, you can put it at our disposal.
She gives Jane 3 stark choices. 1, try to suppress it and live in terror as the visions keep coming. 2, join our side, this mysterious company at St. Anne's, and help save the human race from a very great disaster.
Or 3, tell someone else about it. And if she does that, she will fall into the hands of the enemy, the very people she has seen in her dreams.
Miss Ironwood warns her that these enemies, the conditioners at the N.I.C.E., are just as anxious to use her faculty of vision, but they will care no more about her life and happiness than about those of a fly.
The people in her dreams are real, and they likely know she has been spying on them through the astral plane. The safety of her tidy little flat in Edgestowe is a complete illusion.
The war has already arrived at her doorstep, whether she wants to fight or not.
As we step back and look at the epic scope of what Lewis has set up in just these opening chapters, the thematic brilliance is undeniable.
We have two parallel journeys that are moving in completely opposite directions, but are bound by the same cosmic conflict.
On one side, we have Mark Studdock. He represents the danger of the mundane. His descent into an organization that plans to liquidate backward races and biochemically condition humanity didn't start with him embracing pure evil.
It started with him wanting to sit with the cool kids at a committee meeting. It started with his vanity, his fear of being an outsider, and his willingness to use bureaucratic jargon to mask horrific realities.
The N.I.C.E. uses the machinery, the modern state committees, budgets, PR campaigns to build a dystopia that looks perfectly respectable.
And on the other side, we have Jane Studdock. She represents the terrifying intrusion of the real, ancient supernatural world into our sanitized modern lives.
She wants nothing more than to read her poetry and have a quiet life, but she is dragged kicking and screaming into a reality where severed heads are manipulated in French laboratories and a 5th century druid wizard is buried under the local college woods.
While Mark is being seduced by the sterile, man-made evil of the future, Jane is being violently awakened by the raw, organic, ancient terrors of the past.
Lewis is telling us that both of these extremes are real, and they are barreling toward a catastrophic collision right in the middle of this sleepy little university town.
The deepest evils often start with a simple, mundane desire to belong, to be part of the we. When we sacrifice our moral compass for the sake of professional advancement or social inclusion, we open the door to the kind of systemic atrocities that N.I.C.E. is planning.
Conversely, the greatest, most terrifying truths of our existence are often the things we desperately try to write off as mere nightmares or psychological glitches.
Miss Ironwood's assertion that you are not ill, you have vision, is a challenge to anyone who tries to shrink the universe down to a manageable, rational size.
It is a profound warning about the limits of modern psychology and bureaucratic management. If we reduce humans to mere sociological data points and psychological neuroses, we make ourselves incredibly vulnerable to the very real, very dark forces that Lewis is illustrating.
So true.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over as you go about your week. Lewis wrote this in the 1940s, imagining a physical pragmatometer with colored lights and a massive concrete building full of bureaucrats pulling the levers of societal control.
But think about our world today.
We carry algorithms in our pockets that constantly curate our reality. Social media platforms dictate our social inner rings, punishing us with exclusion if we don't adopt the right jargon or the right opinions.
And these platforms condition our behaviors biochemically through carefully engineered dopamine hits.
As you look at your phone today, ask yourself, are we already living inside the N.I.C.E., having willingly traded our autonomy for the comfort of being in the in-crowd?
And if we are, who among us has the vision to see the ancient, raw reality buried beneath the digital noise?
Keep your eyes open. Until next time.